The paper is actually was published last December in Geographical Research, and it came out of a piece of research when I first started at the university. I was working with Matthew Thompson and Paul Plummer, and we had a paper in applied geography looking at the resource economies and the way that there's a redistribution of wealth across the state, and looking at the royalties for regions and how that might help with that and that sort of thing. And then then I became obsessed with the whole labour idea. So this paper came out of that. So just to give you a little bit of theoretical background, I think there's a range of disciplines here, so hopefully I can do this justice. But, you know, I'm very interested in uneven development and the way that resources get redistributed throughout a system. And you know, in Western Australia we have a lot of single resource towns, and they're very much associated with your boom bust and your cyclonic metaphors, you know, that they come up and then they're down, and places like Whitnum and that sort of thing are good examples of that. But even though we think of them way out in the periphery, they don't add much except for what they do, you know, they're digging out of the ground, they're selling it to the rest of the world, they stand at the frontier of nation building. These are the towns that provide the wealth for the rest of the nation. So, because they're commodities, they facilitate that whole colonisation to industrial process of new territory. So Australia would not be what it is today if it was not off the back of its resources. The UK would not have had that second push of the Industrial Revolution if it had not have been for the gold that was discovered in the goldfields, because there was this whole sort of process of them buying our gold, us buying their industrial products, because we needed everything, you know, when we first started. We had nothing here. So they are deeply impacted by processes of globalisation. So we have to see them as part of this broader system. We can't see them as outside and sort of not really a part of what happens to the economy that is here in Perth. So there are lots of theories that look at this transition of single resource towns to a diversified economy. And one of these theories is Staples theory, which is what I'm going to be focusing on. But we need to when we apply theories to a place, we really need to understand how it fits the local model. We can't just take something from, like Staples theories from Canada, take it from Canada, and even take it from the period of time, which is the 1940s, that Staples theory emerged, take it from that period of time and then transplant it here. We have to understand it in terms of a local context. We have to understand it in terms of the time period now and the type of economy that we're dealing in now. So this paper really examines the evolution of Western Australia through the lens of Innis's Staples theory, which I'm going to explain in a minute. So I will, after this brief intro, I will then review a little bit of the theory. I will then go into my case study site, methods, key findings and conclusions. And because this was a paper delivered at a conference, it theoretically should only be 15 minutes long. So we should, but I'll slow things down and give you lots of like additional things that I didn't give to them. So Innis's theory of regional and community development. So Innis was a researcher in Canada in the 1940s, and he was examining the seal industry, which was a primary resource economy in Canada at the time. And he observed that resource economies were very dependent on their resources for survival. And so through these observations, he made a number of he made a number of observations which then became his theory on Staples theory, on Staples economy and the way that a Staples economy relates between the periphery and the core. So he said that the metropolitan core developed, so places like Perth City, developed through the comparative advantage of peripheral Staples regions. And that is that the money that flows through the core actually comes from outside the regions, which if you talk to people in Perth, they will tell you that Perth is the producer of everything that West Australia is. But if you talk to the regions, you will understand that it's very much linked all the stuff that happens here in Perth is very much linked to what happens in the regions, because we are a resource economy. Whether we're engineers, whether our finance, everything revolves around resources. So, although we are trying to diversify out of that since 2015 and the innovation statement. But Innis said that we can move outside of a staples economy through economic diversification of the peripheries through the staples export process. So as a resource town will start, a few people come, they're digging stuff out of the ground, a staples economy will effectively sell it as soon as it comes out. So the idea is to make money. But as you begin to develop communities, you need services there. You need schools. You need photographers. You need, wedding planners. You need all sorts of things that happen in a community begin to occur, and you get this diversification outside of the staples. But the national political economy, said Innis, creates this framework of very supportive policy and social and economic structures which are not necessarily supportive of diversification, because everyone has an invested interest in the staples. The wage market, people get their wages from resources if they're an engineer. So they are not going to want to move outside. They are going to want to have obviously their jobs. So there is, from the labour point of view, there is an invested interest in terms of wages. The government earns royalties from the mining or from the oil that occurs. So they get a massive amount of money through royalties that come into the core area. So they do not like to shift the economy as well. And then you have the firms, and when you're dealing in resources, well, it depends upon the type of resources, it depends upon the type of economy that you have in, but if you're looking at mining and oil and gas, which we have in Western Australia, there has been this increasing move to bigger and bigger multinational corporations. So we are not just talking about the core economy in terms of Perth itself. We're talking the core economy in terms of where these multinationals are actually taking the profits, where that is the core economy being Europe and USA, which a lot of these corporations come from. Okay? So you can see that everybody has a vested interest in ensuring that we do not move out of the staples economy, which is why when, before 2015 and we had our economy sort of started to dive, and so we all jumped on the innovation ship, which is probably why I got my DECRA. It's sometimes you're out before you come in. So like before that, nobody wanted to know about innovation, and then all of a sudden everybody's like going, oh my God, innovation, that's how you save ourselves. So, but that's why it's very difficult to shift premiers and that sort of thing, or because everybody has this vested interest. So, with staples, though, he says that this leads to what's called the staples trap. So people don't want to move out. However, because he says that you can diversify outside of the staples through community development, there is an implicit assumption by Innis, and remember his theory came out of the 1940s, that there is a stickiness of labour, that labour somehow does not move, that we have workers that go to a place and they work. And then these people buy services, which creates these towns or resource towns. But if we look at West Australia or places now, we don't have that. There's no such thing as workers going to a community and working. We have these long-distance commuting relationships that adds technological capacity to the region, because one of the things about a staples economy is it is all about productivity. You need to increase your productivity of your region. So it's all about how do you get your staples out of the ground to market as quickly as possible. That means that everyone, those three actors I talked about, labour, multinationals and government, and even maybe academia is in there as well, because they're the ones doing all the educating of the labour. They all work to minimise or maximise the profits for themselves in their various, you know, whether through wages, whether through royalties, or whether through profits, firm profits, so that there is the biggest amount of wealth that is left over. So that is the key thing for all these actors, is to maximise profits and minimise expenses. So the long-distance commuting workforce that we have really provides an additional way, a technological capacity, increases efficiency in the system. There is increased flexibility in terms of your labour force. You don't have to employ one engineer in one site for 30, 50 years. You can have that same engineer with a highly, highly specialised, can go around to lots of different sites. You can have a construction period that occurs over probably, what, 5, 10 years that we had. And you can have a labour force up there. In 10 years, you can bring them all back. You can have hotbeds, what they call hotbeds, where you have a 24-hour rotation of people sleeping. You have one bed that is used for 24 hours. This is a highly efficient machine for making money. This is not about creating communities. There is specialisation, so that the specialisation, when you're not looking just at when your pool of labour is just not your small market, you've got this whole specialisation of not only the state, the nation, and the world. Because when you're sort of talking to people along life, you hear of people in Canada that used to fly helicopters because they've got some specialised thing. They fly helicopters here. So it's not just, we're not just talking about commuting in WA, we're talking about it from a global perspective as well as national. And also you don't need to build towns, you don't need the hassle of schools and all that sort of stuff that comes with bringing families up there and all. You just have to, worry about the sanity of your workers or the breaking up of families and that sort of stuff. So you do all that back in Perth, but it still saves you money. So there are what happens then is the income that would have created this diversification process is leaked back to the commuter towns, which means that no towns are now replacing the new towns that we used to have in terms of that diversification process. And this is what generates the uneven regional development that we see across the state, where there are winners and there are losers. And that is through a variety of factors in terms of, path dependence and so history and amenity, the level of amenity and resource wealth of a community and that sort of stuff. So how long, when that community was established, because those communities that were established way back probably have a better rate of survival than those that have come up more recently. Okay. So that gives you an overview of Innis's theory, and also what disturbed me about Innis's theory, which is that he didn't actually, he just assumes that Labor's stuck there, which is why, and that really disturbed me about his theory, which is why I ended up writing this paper. So, yeah.
But it was probably true.
Yeah, that's what I said. In the 1940s, that's where you've got to understand the different eras. In the 1940s, that's what he was examining. But there's been no one since then that has actually brought up this point, which to me is fascinating because, someone from Western Australia, that's all we're concerned about is FIFO. And we probably are one of the most prevalent in the world. I mean, I think Canada would also have a lot of that now as well.
I was going to ask how prevalent it is in other parts of the world.
I don't know.
In the U.S., you've got geographies where we assume commute times for a remote place that workers will be willing to commute 3 hours, so 6-hour round trip effectively. But we don't have the scale of FIFO or long distance commute that
Although, if you look at the US, if you look at the way that you work, you do have a lot of cross-country flying for just business trips and.
Sure.
So I think there's different forms.
And we did see that with Silicon Valley and the long-distance commutes out to Austin.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
This is kind of though. Canada, come from Canada originally.
Yeah.
It's very much linked to geographical specificities. That
Yeah.
you can't live up in the up there as you can't live up in Yellowknife or Dawson or other places up there. Maybe the Chinese are the same thing.
Yeah.
They have things in Inner Mongolia or way out in the west of the country. I don't know. In China, they probably would have the same. I know they have it with Mongolia.
Yeah.
So it's got to do with
and it's got to do with that. It's also got to do with the specialisation of labour. So we've got this different type of labour now. We're not going out the back with our shovels anymore and panning. We've actually got this highly specialised labour that costs a lot of money. Now, you can, when you have a specialised labour force, you can afford to send them different places. If you're so China might, and poorer countries may have a different model because they have cheap labour of $1 a day. So they can just shove them all in one block, and they're not going to waste money flying people up and down. So there are different models in different countries. But in sort of Canada and Australia, definitely a lot of these, the higher paid ones, which even the storemen are high paid in Australia, they fly up and down. Whereas maybe in some places you wouldn't have storemen would be so highly paid. So all of you are probably familiar with West Australia, and this is sort of a range of the resources that we produce here, and we all know that we have an amazing diversity of resource wealth in this state, which arguably supports the nation in terms of the nation. And there's always that contention, is it, between Western Australia and the rest, And we are one of the wealthiest in the world. We have some of the highest. I think we're number 4 in gold. Is it number 1 in iron ore, uranium, and nickel, and all. So we're sort of in that top for all sorts of things. In terms of oil and gas, I think we're rising. I'm not sure if we're number 4 now, or we were, but it looks like we're going up as well. So we have this, it's not finishing. We've got this incredible resource wealth to tap into. And it does impact, the way that our regions are developed do impact, because the theory is the richer you get, then your communities grow. And that's what people hope for, and that's what the government promises us, that we will have growth in these areas, in these regional communities. But if we look at Innis and start to question the model in terms of the labour side, then we see that growth is not necessarily going to occur. So that's the area that I was sort of looking at, but I did actually look at commuting across the whole of Australia, because you can't really look at commuting by just looking at a small part of it. So that's the goldfields there. And I don't know whether there's 3, is there 5? Yeah, so you've got Kalgoorlie, Boulder, Coolgardie, Leonora, Laverton, Menzies, and Dundas. And so in 2013-14, it generated 9.1 billion, or 7% of the state's total wealth. So there's quite a lot of wealth that comes from just that region. So from a historic point of view, so WA in about 1859 had 1,300 people. So a very, very small state. By 1891, so 40 years later, we had grown to 50,000. So we'd grown a little bit more. But from 1891 to 1901, so that's 10 years later, we had grown, we'd gone to 89,000 people. Then another 10 years later, we went from 89,000 to 288,000. So what we see is this very, very slow, from the beginning of the state, this very, very slow accumulation of people. Most of them were in agriculture. They were supported by the state, and they were encouraged to be in the wheat belt. We did have a very good transport system put in throughout the wheat belt. But it wasn't until the 1890s that we really saw the state expand. Now, that coincided in 1891. That is where they first found gold, and in Coolgardie, and people began to realise that, hey, you know, they were coming off the back of Melbourne's gold rush, and the people were beginning to realise, hey, maybe there's a lot of wealth here. And they actually found a lot more wealth than even had happened in Melbourne. And so we had this rush come in, and within a 10-year period, the state developed from between Perth and Kalgoorlie. We saw the rail, the communications, we saw water, pipelines, we saw towns spring up all along the way. So there was this in 10 years, there was a massive amount of state development, which I'm not even sure that we have seen since, because when we're looking at the amount of infrastructure that went in between these really geographically disparate, like, apart places, it is amazing. And all of this stuff, you've got to realise it came from England, because it was cheaper. It was cheaper to transport something all the way from London here than it was to go from York in the wheat belt to here. I think York, it used to cost about £27 per something around whatever it was. I should have I looked at this. And coming from England, it cost like £4. So there was a difference of £20 because of the transport, because we just didn't have the transport. So anyway, I'd like to read you this quote. And so this gives you a sense of what it was like in this time and how the communities actually became about. So from the first loan prospectors and the mine labourers arrived, and then the company bosses, their accountants and bankers. There were shopkeepers and hoteliers, the cooks and the scrubber women who worked for the moneyed, and the priests who cared for the poor. The professionals came, the architects, mine engineers, tradesmen, artists, and most notably photographers, all seeking opportunities to practice their vocations. There were barmen, actors, musicians, prostitutes, and a myriad of other workers and fast operators who came to populate and profit from a place of burgeoning industry. By 1902, there were over 50 towns. Most survived no more than a decade, as local mines began to fail only after a few decades. Many tens of thousands of bricks a week were sent by rail to build other towns as residents moved on, a pattern of demolition and removal. So they would actually take the bricks with them and then go build the next town. So it's fascinating the way that it came about. So really, it really portrays to you the sense of openness to opportunities and economic activities and the diversification that was happening in the economy. But there was this ongoing sense of isolation and this perceived lack of government support, which really sets the region up for what we now know as the FIFO sort of model. Because it used to take them, there was 600 kilometres between Perth and Kalgoorlie. It took them, it took them weeks, because they used to walk their wheelbarrows from Perth to Kalgoorlie. So, I mean, there's an incredible amount of hardship that went. So when we look at Innis's framework, then we begin to understand how the extreme remoteness of this place has set up our FIFO the way that we work now. And has then we see this exaggerated sort of the rural migratory patterns across Australia, really. We understand that as well. So, already I'm running out of time. So, the method I used. So I use a two-step process. I do a lot of social network analysis, which basically looks at the network of a place, or I'm primarily interested in geography. So I wanted to map the commuting flows across all local governments, across the whole of Australia, so that's 448 local governments. And then I took those metrics that I got from the social network analysis, as well as a few other indicators, and I did a regression to look at the wealth redistribution across the whole of, actually across West Australia. So I just focused on West Australian local governments, 106, where the commuters and workers reside, and then I further focused down in on Kalgoorlie as the bit of the case study area. So, but it is in the context of the state because of the social network analysis. So I looked the regression looked at the change between 2001 and 2011 in economic wealth between each of the local governments. And then I regressed that against the 2011, so the percent of national total for each of the in-commuting, out-commuting population, and for the gross regional product. So looked at each LGA in terms of its percent. So basically, you're almost getting, what you've got then is a scale from 0 to 100, where you've got a ranking then on how well each, or where each LGA sits. And data was from the Australian Bureau of Statistics.
Just for clarity, can you just go back? So on the left-hand side, you've got the change in economic. So that's the left.
Economic wealth, yes.
Right.
So that is from the GRP. That's the change in GRP.
So you've got the change of GRP on the left-hand side.
Yeah.
And you've got the level of GR.
Yeah.
So the share of national GRP
Yeah.
in that LGA on the right
Yes.
hand side.
Yeah. Okay. So the share regressed against that change. So what they were. Yeah.
And averaged over 2000, averaged over that 10-year period. No.
So this is 2011 only.
Yeah.
So this is what the end is, the end point is. But I looked at what. Yeah. So that's what the end point was. But I looked at the 2001, 2011 change. So, so can you actually predict that change? Is it dependent on the wealth that they are now? So those more, you'd think that the more wealthy, or those with the biggest change, were actually the more wealthy, those with the biggest communities and that sort of stuff. So I assumed that there was a link between wealth and community. Okay, so this is the social network analysis. This is what it looks like with everybody crossing the country. So you can see we have this massive amount of commuting that occurs. The size of the circles are the number of in-commuting people. So, I mean, I could have done all sorts of different metrics, but I decided to focus in on those in. So these places, the biggest circles are those working. They're your working hubs. So we've got places in WA like Roebourne, Ashburton, East Pilbara, Port Hedland, Leonora, Laverton. So, and there's quite a lot in in the Goldfields region. And for those that know Western Australia, that makes sense. And Perth, of course, has the biggest, because don't forget this is in commuters. So these are people coming in. I discounted those people that are actually working in there. Okay. So I might skip over that. That's just a summary. So I'll just go through the results, and I will read off this. So what I found was that there was a positive link between the wealth change, so the change in wealth across the period, were the strongest in the less wealthy LGAs. So those people that had less money actually grew. Their wealth had grown more, which is, I would have thought that those people with more money grew more, but no, it wasn't that. These relationships grew stronger as wealthier regions were excluded. So there was up the very top of, in terms of wealth, there was particularly a lot of really wealthy ones like the Pilbara, that sort of thing. You cut them out and started to look at those more moderately wealthy LGAs, then the results became a little bit easier to probably decipher, because they're probably a little bit of outliers in terms of their wealth and their ability to attract community. So it suggested that the populations of the wealthy LGAs were either not growing or growing substantially less than the poorer LGAs. So we've got a situation where the poor LGAs are actually the ones growing. How does that happen, I wonder? How the poor LGAs are the ones that their communities are growing. Does anyone have any ideas?
So you're defining the poor LGAs. How is poor defined here?
Well, that's gross regional product. On gross regional product, the poorest LGAs on gross regional product are the ones that are doing the best in terms of attracting community.
Because I would think poor needs a per capita definition.
Well, but I mean, you could do it per capita, but isn't that the whole point? That's the whole point. You should have the wealthier ones. By Innis's thing, you should have the wealthier ones should have the biggest communities. But they don't. They have the smallest, and those ones are shrinking as well.
So just in terms of causality here, the dependent variable on the regression is the change in the GDP.
GRP, yeah.
So the model's saying that if you have lots of population growth, you reduce your wealth. So
Yeah, you've got less wealth.
So your model implicitly is driving. I wasn't sure whether the question you just asked us was going the other way, was saying why do poor communities?
So the thing is, you actually have to think of where those poor communities are. Then it sort of all becomes clear, because the poor communities are what? Albany, Broome, Geraldton. They're the poor communities. We don't think of them as poor communities, but they're the ones that, and they actually, I mean, it's not 100% true, because those ones too do have quite a lot of regional product. But when you think of the wealthy ones, like the Pilbara, Port Hedland, those ones actually have they don't have the capacity to attract as much as some of these other communities that don't have the wealth, but they have that attractor. So again, it goes back to when I was talking about the model, the point where it depends on history. What's that?
Wealth or income?
So it's the wealth of the LGA. So it's the contribution of the local government to the state coffers.
So that's income.
Yeah, income to the state. It's a flow to the state. Yeah, to the state. So how much do they contribute to the total of the state? So it's not looking at the wealth of the people, because if we looked at that, we would have a different scenario. It's actually looking at the wealth of the LGA and what they contribute to the state. And Innis would say that that's how you grow, that's how your diversification happens. But in our case, we don't find that. Diversification happens in those places which are less wealthy, which are more they tend to be on the beach. They're Perth obviously is one, but I discounted Perth from this obviously. But it is not the ones in the middle of nowhere that are actually producing a lot of wealth for the state, but they don't have amenity there.
Places where people actually want to live.
It's places where people want to live, exactly, and that's what the model actually showed. That there's something different happening here that is not explained by community development models up until this point, because we tend to think of community development as occurring around diversification. We have this sort of idealised version of the world. So this questions that idealised version.
I find this quite confusing, but I mean, was there a distinction between sort of company tags where you're going to find that they're highly productive because they're pumping out lots of stuff.
Yeah.
No one really wants to live there.
Yeah.
And over time, there's substitution of labour, capital for labour.
Yep. Yep.
And so, I mean, you're not differentiating between communities.
So what I was looking at too is the way...
Quite characteristically, they're quite different, these
They are.
communities. So Kalgoorlie's
very different
from some mine site that's 500 miles north of...
Yeah, and Kalgoorlie actually has a capacity that is an attractive place too. You do have... it's probably one of the only inland regional communities that operates similar. And it perhaps is because it's one of the originals.
Is it just that people don't want to live there, or is it that, in fact, the companies are using FIFOs?
Well, it's a combination of all.
They don't encourage this stuff.
Well, as I said, there's the three elements there. There's everybody's in there to make profits, whether it's the workers, whether it's the government. So it's everyone is sort of. I'm not sure that there's one factor, because workers are choosing to live in these other places. They're choosing because they can get better education for their kids. They can get access to amenities and all these other things that they can't get in some of these regional communities. And I mean, what I was interested in too, because it's you're looking at social network analysis, so you actually understand the way it flows across. So it's not just The regression, incorporated into the regression, is this understanding of the way that the wealth moves. So that was the other thing too, is that the wealth is actually the in commuting, which, here, that, I hadn't actually got to that bit yet. If we look here, so the out commuting, so those places that people live and then they go out to work, those places, they have a very, they become the wealthiest. And the in-commuting, those places where people are going for work, so the workplaces, you see in this under 5% of the GDP, you see these ones are insignificant, but here it's significant, it's negative. So there's actually this transfer of wealth that's occurring, because, so that's the income leakages. So the wealth is not only, it's not just about the GRP of the which is what I measured here, the GRP of the LGA that contributes. Actually, the workers are redistributing that wealth, because the majority of workers don't spend their money in the LGA they work in. They actually wait till they get home.
Just get one thing, the percent in, percent out,
Yeah.
are these also the value, the differences between 2001 2011?
No, that's just that's the pure 2011. So that's just looking at, in 2011, those places that had the going in and out more, what is the relationship to that change? So I would have thought if you had a big change, we would have seen, according to Innis, if you had a big change, you would have seen perhaps you would have seen probably less in and out, so you'd have more communities settling, because your population, so this is percent of population, so population has a negative effect. So actually the bigger your population is, the less wealthy, the less, you've got a more of a negative change. So there's a reverse relationship between population. But what you find is those places that have the largest population are also those places that are sending the workers out.
Population is a stock variable, and it represents a stock
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
population or labour.
Yeah.
I wonder whether this is the capital measure that's missing, the stock of capital, or the productive capacity.
Yeah.
And whether that would be an important variable to put in
Yeah.
as a regressor that would counterbalance, we'd say that it actually would have the sort of symmetric,
Yeah.
anti-symmetric
Yeah.
effect as a population. I wonder if you included that, what would happen?
Well, I would assume that if you include that, it would show, because don't forget you got in and out. So the assumption of the model is a little bit that you're assuming that if a place is importing labour, that they don't have capacity. If they have to import labour to do the jobs because they don't have that labour there to do the jobs of that region, then the assumption of this model is that they don't have the capacity.
Well, that's in terms of labour. And we're talking in terms of capital
Growth. Okay.
K,
Yeah.
UK,
Yeah.
right, in your models.
Yeah.
We've got L there. We don't have K.
No, we don't.
And then
Well, we have GDP. We have GDP.
how is it distributed?
I mean, I could have got more and more complex. I could have, but I was trying to keep it simple, and I was very much focused on the commuting aspect and understanding if there was a redistribution, or whether in a I mean, it is a simple model, in a simple way, whether Innis was right or not, or whether there was something else occurring in our economy that was not accounted for. So, yeah.
So I think it's interesting, and when I look at it, it's almost like the convergence analysis. You're aware of that literature on convergence analysis?
Some of it. I don't know exactly which
So
what.
it
I mean, I come from a geography, so it might be
this is
slightly
just a
different.
Conditional convergence
Yeah.
analysis. But what is important is to think about that spatial heterogeneity.
Yeah.
Because as Ben was trying to say, we still expect that there would be some spatial heterogeneity across these different regions, and those would have the effect on whether people move there or not. So is there a way that you can be able to, for instance, look at those communities and try to characterize those communities maybe into some subgroups,
Yeah.
depending on how you can be able to do that, and then control for that in your model.
Yeah, and you could do that through social network through social network analysis. You could organise groups based on the different metrics of commuting, which I would think you could use for that sort of thing, and it's definitely something to try.
An interesting intermediate would be able to find an explanation that would predict,
Yeah.
to predict
Yeah.
the inflows.
Yes.
So you get characteristics
Yeah.
of your different
Yes.
LGAs
Yeah.
and predict the inflows
Yeah.
and see whether it matches your data.
Yeah.
Whereas that, to me, that is an interesting
Yeah.
question.
Yes.
That's sort of underlying that.
Yes, it definitely, because if you could get the characteristics of the LGAs, it would actually support, because at the moment this model does not do that. But actually, funny enough, my DECRA does actually start to tease out some of those characteristics. But it's not to do with wealth distribution, it's got to do with it's the innovation side, the distribution of ideas.
I'm just worried about your stats, your model.
Well, it's probably really bad.
In the sense, well, I think you've got some real outliers. So just taking 3 guys
Yeah.
out, and all of a sudden in becomes significant, and GDP factor of 4 bigger. You take another 5 out, in has gone, GDP has gone doubled again. So I'm just worried that what you're seeing is really being, there's a few observations in there which are giving real leverage in terms of what you're seeing.
Mm.
And
So
I'm worried as to
yeah.
what, to the extent to which it's robust, I suppose.
Yeah, and yeah, I mean, I tried to make it robust by doing the 3 models, so discounting the wealthiest LGAs and took out, so because some of those were purely outliers and like, they're phenomenally wealthy. We're talking about the Pilbara, you know, it's, yeah, so of course that's going to happen. You know,
They're company tax.
Yeah.
They got nothing else going for it. If you took the
That's
working,
right.
If you took the working population as a percentage, it'd be about 100%.
That's right. So that's why I cut at. So this one has all of those in there. Then I went down to the under 0.5% GDP, and then I went down even smaller, where you've just got the very, very small LGAs, and looked at those. So tried to understand it from the different perspectives, and kept cutting. And actually ran the model. I've run it so many times, trying to find the break point of where that change occurs. But yeah. But anyway.
You can do analysis which does leave leverage to actually work out which data points in here are really driving particular, and if that would reveal that there's, and it may just be GDP that's actually the ones which are, there may be some other ones which are really just
like superfluous.
Well, not superfluous, actually delivering all your results.
Yeah. Okay.
Sort of, and I think that would be interesting because there's something happening
Yeah.
in here, and it's just that big jump, taking 3 out and seeing those changes.
Yeah.
And you just wonder if you take another 3 out. On a different criteria, where would you?
Yeah.
So it's,
yeah.
They're so diverse.
It is so diverse, and it is a problem with. I mean, it is a problem with the model because you've got this huge diversity, and you're trying to make generalised assumptions when, yeah.
You mentioned spending. You say where the spending is occurring is important. So this is. So you are trying to see how much growth there is in income, or some measure of income, as a function of how many people are going out, how many people are coming in, and population growth, right?
Well, population growth that's the dependent.
Okay.
So looking at seeing that change and whether that change has anything to do with their wealth, like where they're ranked on terms of their wealth, commuting
so
out.
What the percent
Of population. So that's just 2011.
Okay, percent of what?
Of the nation.
Okay, I think that's a problem because when you look at economic activity going from one year to the next, what is going to change that? What's going to change that is the number of people in there and how that's changing, not the number of people there as a proportion of the nation. So you want to see if the population is growing or coming down, not as a proportion of the nation. entirely different measure. But to measure how the economic activity is changing between years, what's going to drive that? Well, spending is a big part. You said spending before. So the people going out, having a positive effect means those people probably are going out, but the money is coming back.
Yeah, well, that's what I was saying.
Yeah. And
But this GDP, I haven't accounted for all money. I was just looking at the wealth in terms of their contribution to the nation. That's all I was looking at, because Innis says that if you have a wealthier LGA, and you could put income in here. Like there's all sorts of sources of wealth, and so there's income, there's royalties as well. That's another one that you probably should add to the model. But I wanted just to look at Innis's assumption that the contribution of the LGA to the nation, which is what he says, or to that generation, because you're exporting to the rest of the world, that contribution can allow you looking at in terms of population and in terms of commuting, and trying to see whether there would be an income leakage, because if there is a large in and out commute, which is what I found, then you have that income leakage. And then, of course, even though they are theoretically wealthy, actually that wealth is all going to the core. And so that's what Innis says. So my model then says, well, not only is it the wealth, because Innis says that Innis says that you will get diversification in your community if income remains in the region. So my model says income does not remain in the region. Income comes back to the core. So that was, even though there's lots of different ways I could look at this, that was primarily what I was trying to investigate, is to say that Innis's model does not work in Western Australia, and we cannot get community development in our communities if we don't understand the way that the way that wealth is redistributed. And it's not just the wealth of, it's not just the royalties where we have to redistribute royalties back. It's not just the wealth of corporates, where they're just mining and taking. That's what because the GRP is really a reflection of that corporate sort of wealth, or and that's the money earned from the. It's not really looking at income of people at all, because that would be accounted for in your source regions. That would be that income. Yeah, okay, all right.
Is this a good conclusion slide?
Well, it is sort of the next one. The next actually was the conclusion slide, and we've sort of talked about it all anyway. I've sort of given you what the conclusions were, that Innis's model did not work from what I saw. But I do take on board all your comments. And there's a lot of different ways that you could continue to test it. And my model, whether it's robust or not, I don't know.
On that, we've kind of used up our question quota and maybe given you a bit of a hard time.
That's all right. As long as I sort of answered it. I mean, the thing is, you're a researcher. You get to a stage where you realise you can't answer all questions anyway, so fine. And that gives everyone else time. You can now go away and think about it.
Thank you for sharing a different perspective on some of these issues to the way we might typically tackle things. So if you can join me in thanking Kirsten for it.
Thank you.